They didn't let me grab my bag. Two uniformed police officers stopped beside my desk. Not rushed, not tense. Calm, almost polite, like this was routine. One of them said my name the way people do when they're reading it off a screen, flat, certain, already decided. My manager stood a few steps behind them, hands folded. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look uncomfortable either. He cleared his throat and said, "We've identified a risk." For a moment, I smiled. Not because I thought it was funny, but because my brain refused to accept what I was hearing. A risk. I honestly thought he had the wrong word or the wrong person. I waited for clarification that never came. The officer gestured toward the aisle. I reached down automatically for my bag, pure muscle memory, and he shook his head. "Leave it." That was when the room changed. The office went quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like someone had muted the world too suddenly. Keyboards stopped. The chairs froze. Conversations ended mid-thought. People didn't stare openly. They glanced, then looked away quickly, like whatever was happening to me might spread if they acknowledged it for too long. There was no HR meeting, no closed-door discussion, no explanation of what I was accused of or why police were suddenly involved, just movement, direction, finality. As we walked, I passed desks where I'd sat in meetings just days earlier, past coworkers I had trained, past people who knew my habits, my routines, my work ethic. I wanted to say something, anything, but the moment didn't allow it. The silence felt intentional, like it was part of the procedure. At the exit, one of the officers said, "You'll be contacted." By who? For what? When? The door closed behind me before I could ask. I stood there for a second, holding nothing, staring at my reflection in the glass. I didn't look dangerous. I didn't look unstable. I looked confused. I looked like someone who had just been removed from their own life without warning. The drive home felt unreal. I kept expecting my phone to ring with an apology, a correction. Someone told me there had been a mistake, that they'd reviewed the file again and realized they had the wrong person. Nothing came. And what made it worse was how normal everything had been before that day. My performance reviews were strong. No warnings, no complaints. I handled sensitive systems daily, the kind of access you don't give to people you don't trust. I trained new hires. I signed approvals. Trust wasn't implied. It was documented. So I replayed everything in my head over and over, searching for the moment where my life quietly tipped without me noticing. I couldn't find it. The silence after that day was worse than the escort itself. No calls, no emails, no official notice explaining what had happened or what I was accused of. It felt like I hadn't just been removed from the building, but erased from the system entirely. My access was gone. My name stopped appearing in threads. It was as if I'd never been there at all. Every morning, I checked my inbox expecting something, anything, that would make the situation make sense. A formal allegation. A request for a statement. An HR appointment. Instead, there was nothing. Silence has a way of making your mind fill in the gaps, and none of the possibilities were comforting. A week later, an envelope arrived. No company logo. No letterhead. No explanation. Just paperwork. Inside was a document I was never meant to see. An internal risk assessment. The kind written for compliance teams and executives, not for the person whose life it quietly dismantles. My name appeared at the top, not as a subject, not as a concern, as a classification. Potential internal threat. I read that line slowly, then read it again. I waited for the context to soften it. It didn't. Below it were bullet points, short clinical phrases that sounded serious without actually saying anything specific. Behavioral unpredictability, emotional instability, possible data exposure risk. No dates, no incidents. No examples, no references to conversations or actions, just vague language dressed up as analysis. The kind of wording that feels authoritative enough to be believed and slippery enough to avoid challenge. None of it was true. At first, I felt panic, not because I doubted myself, but because I understood what those words could do. How do you defend yourself against something that doesn't accuse you of a concrete act? How do you disprove a suggestion? How do you argue with a feeling written in an official language? I read the document again, slower this time. That's when I noticed the details most people wouldn't. Formatting inconsistencies, reference numbers that didn't quite align, timestamps that seemed off. I requested the attached records. Submission logs, approval history, metadata. It took persistence and more patience than I wanted to spend, but eventually the pieces came together. The report wasn't written after the police escort. It was created 2 weeks earlier. That realization hit harder than anything else. 2 weeks earlier, I had refused a request from my supervisor, an instruction that would have violated internal policy and crossed into something illegal. At the time, I documented my refusal and moved on. I believed professionalism was enough. I believed doing the right thing would protect me. Seeing the dates shattered that belief. The escort wasn't a reaction. The silence wasn't confusing. The report wasn't an assessment, it was preparation. The risk wasn't about safety. It was about removing someone who wouldn't comply and building a paper trail that made it look justified. Once I understood that, the confusion gave way to something colder. Not anger, not fear, clarity. And clarity changes how you move. Once I saw the timeline clearly, I stopped hoping for an explanation and started asking for accountability. I requested a meeting with HR, not an informal check-in, not a phone call, a documented meeting. I wanted everything said in that room to exist somewhere other than memory. They agreed surprisingly fast. When I walked in, the tone was calm, almost rehearsed. No one looked surprised to see me. No one looked concerned either. They spoke the way people do when they believe the situation is already settled. They didn't deny the report. They didn't challenge the police escort. Instead, they reframed everything. "It was precautionary," one of them said. Another added, "These assessments are subjective by nature." Then, almost casually, "These things happen." I asked how a precaution could exist before an incident, how subjectivity justified labeling someone emotionally unstable without evidence, how police involvement fits into internal procedure for a situation with no documented breach. They didn't answer directly. They never do. They spoke in circles, using language that sounded reasonable without committing to anything specific. They emphasized intent over outcome, process over impact. What struck me wasn't what they said, it was how comfortable they were saying it. They expected me to accept it, to absorb the implication quietly, to carry the label without contesting it, to move on as if this was an unfortunate but normal part of corporate life. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about a report or a bad decision. This was about a system designed to protect itself, not the people inside it. A system that relied on confusion and intimidation to keep things tidy. I left that meeting knowing one thing for certain. If I didn't push back, the story they'd written about me would be the only one that existed. So I didn't try to argue anymore. I documented everything, dates, phrases, who said what and when. I stopped speaking emotionally and started speaking precisely. Then I took the entire file to an employment attorney. He read through the documents slowly, carefully. When he finished, he didn't hesitate. "This is retaliation," he said, "and it's defamatory." He explained it plainly. False statements presented as risk. Language chosen specifically to justify removal without proof. A paper trail designed to look compliant while punishing refusal. Once legal notice was sent, the company changed overnight. Emails that had gone unanswered were suddenly returned within minutes. Meetings were requested. Phrases like miscommunication and procedural review started appearing. The tone softened. The certainty disappeared. They didn't argue the facts. They negotiated. That told me everything I needed to know. When authority is confident, it explains nothing. When it's cornered, it starts bargaining. For the first time since the officers stood at my desk, the balance shifted. The negotiation was quiet, efficient, and deliberately uneventful. There were no dramatic apologies, no admissions of wrongdoing spoken out loud. Just careful language, revised documents, and a clear desire to make the situation disappear as cleanly as possible. The risk assessment was formally retracted. My internal record was cleared. The settlement terms were confidential. Precise, final, on paper it looked like a resolution. But what stayed with me wasn't the agreement itself. It was what happened immediately afterward. Policies changed. Not gradually, not symbolically, quickly. Risk reports could no longer be filed by a single supervisor. Independent review became mandatory. Vague psychological language now required documented evidence. Escalations involving law enforcement needed multiple approvals and written justification. They rewrote the rules because the old ones had failed under scrutiny. Not because they suddenly believed in fairness, but because one false narrative hadn't survived being examined line by line. That's when I started thinking about the people who never get that far. The ones who are escorted out and never see the paperwork. The ones who don't know they can request logs or metadata. The ones who assume the company must be right because companies usually sound certain when they act. I thought about how easily language can replace truth when it's wrapped in procedure. How words like risk and precaution can quietly erase years of work without ever making a direct accusation. What happened to me wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic. There were no raised voices or slammed doors. It was calm, controlled, almost polite. That's what made it dangerous. Because when systems fail, we expect them to look broken, disorganized, emotional. But the most damaging failures look professional. They look reasonable. They look like everyone involved is simply doing their job. And if you don't slow down and examine the details, they pass for truth. I kept replaying the moment I walked out. How clean it was, how I practiced. How no one asked questions, not because they didn't care, but because the process itself discouraged curiosity. Authority has a way of borrowing credibility from its own confidence. Uniforms, titles, forms, signatures. They create the illusion that something must be justified simply because it's happening. But justification isn't the same as accuracy. I realized how close I'd come to accepting the story they'd written for me. How easy it would have been to internalize it. To carry the doubt quietly and move on, never knowing what had actually happened. And I wondered how many people do exactly that. How many leave believing they were the problem because no one ever showed them the timeline. The edits, the motives hiding between the lines. The system didn't break that day. It worked exactly as designed. And that realization stayed with me longer than any settlement ever could. I don't think about the settlement anymore. What stays with me is the lesson I didn't ask to learn. Being escorted out doesn't automatically mean guilt. It doesn't mean danger. It doesn't mean instability. Sometimes it means you become inconvenient. Sometimes it means you said no when yes was expected. Sometimes it means someone with authority decided that removing you was easier than dealing with what you represented. Power rarely announces itself as retaliation. It hides behind language, behind procedure, behind words that sound neutral enough to pass without challenge. Risk, precaution, process. Those words don't feel violent. They don't sound personal, and that's why they work. For a long time after everything ended, I replayed the early moments. The silence, the confidence with which they acted, the way no one questioned it. Not because they agreed, but because questioning felt unsafe. Because authority had already framed the narrative. I realized how close I'd come to accepting it myself. If I hadn't seen the paperwork, I might have believed I'd missed something. That maybe there was a version of me I didn't fully understand. That doubt is powerful. Systems depend on it. They don't need you to agree with them. They just need you to stop resisting. What protected me wasn't anger. It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't even courage in the dramatic sense. It was documentation, dates, timelines, written refusals, records that didn't change their story depending on who read them. Systems can survive mistakes. They can survive complaints. They can survive outrage and bad press. But they struggle with consistency when it's challenged. Because records don't get nervous. They don't soften their language. They don't reframe themselves to sound reasonable. They just sit there, unchanged, waiting to be read. I think about the people who never get access to that clarity. The ones who leave quietly, carrying questions they never get answered. The ones who assume authority must equal truth, because it usually sounds so confident. I understand now how easily reputations can be damaged without a single accusation ever being spoken out loud. How silence can be engineered. How removal can be framed as responsibility instead of retaliation. And I understand something else too. Calm is powerful, staying factual when others want emotion. Staying precise when others rely on implication. Staying present when the system expects you to disappear. That's what unsettles people who misuse authority, not outrage, not threats. No noise, clarity. Because once clarity enters the room, the story can't be controlled anymore. I wasn't escorted out because I was a risk. I was escorted out because I refused to become one. And in the end, the thing they feared most wasn't exposure or liability. It was the record. Because authority can rewrite policy, but it can't rewrite time.